Well, here we are, and the debate and the argument and the headlines continue about coronavirus. They can't be allowed to escape comment. I know politicians believe that they're doing their best, but I'm reminded of the former British Prime Minister William Gladstone, who once argued that, and I quote, "Men are able to mistake the strength of their feeling for the strength of their argument. The heated mind resents the chill touch and relentless scrutiny of logic." Logic here is singularly lacking. For example, since March, the death toll in Victoria is 29. Following the Ruby Princess, the death toll in New South Wales is 49. But to avoid the continuing alarmism, we should point out that in all of Australia today, there are 83 people in hospital and 28 in intensive care. Yet you've got people in deep distress. One person, many are writing, and I feel sorry for them. One person said, "I feel like this is a bad dream, where our leaders and the media have gone mad and they're dragging the masses with them. I feel powerless, but take heart that a handful are not afraid to speak some obvious truths." Well, let me give you some of those obvious truths. I've said 1,000 times, any man's death diminishes me because, as John Donne said, I am part of mankind. But we're constantly assailed by the death toll in America. 140,000. That represents 0.004% of the population. In the UK, 45,000. That represents 0.067% of the population. In Germany, 9,000. That represents 0.011% of the population. In Australia, 113, which represents 0.0004% of the population. Are we entitled to be confused? Is this a pandemic? If the rules keep changing, how can business cope? We just seem to be piling worry on top of worry. For example, in New South Wales, one person's in hospital and 2 are in intensive care. Yet all the pubs have had ridiculous limitations imposed upon them. The figures are made up. Same rules for a pub in Tamworth or Bourke as for the pub identified with the coronavirus cluster in southwest Sydney. Am I the only one shaking my head? Then there's the business about face masks. I said last night, where is the evidence that face masks on everybody will make a difference? As Professor Ian Fraser says, if someone has tested positive, wear the face mask. But are we going to be dictatorially told to wear face masks, whether we've tested positive or not? Then we're told the app for smartphones, which was meant to be the key to identifying where you've been and with whom you've come into contact, we're told that it's no lifesaver. Yet politicians say we're all in this together, but none of them have lost a quid. No public servants lost a quid. This is a private sector recession. What we really have here is a virus which is changing the whole power structure of Western democracy. Capitalism and our way of life are under siege. What's going to replace them? I note the comments from the ex-UK Supreme Court judge, Lord Jonathan Sumption, former Supreme Court judge. And he asked a simple question recently: does government have a policy for coronavirus? He answers his own question by saying it appears they've got several policies. He said, quote, "The root of the problem is the uncomfortable relationship between government and its scientific advisors." He says the government has repeatedly claimed to be guided by the science. This has, in practice, been shameless. He said a shameless attempt to evade responsibility by passing the buck to scientists for what are ultimately political and not scientific decisions. As Lord Sumption says, scientists can advise what measures are likely to reduce the infections and deaths, but only politicians can decide whether those measures make sense in economic and social terms. He makes the point that the committee of scientists advising the British government, and this is minuted, were unenthusiastic about lockdowns, unenthusiastic about forbidding large gatherings or closing schools. As Lord Sumption says, from an early stage, they, that's the scientific advisors, had pointed out that the real threat was to people over 70 and those with serious underlying medical conditions. Since March 5, he said, they've been advising the government to cocoon those people who either had the disease or lived in the same household. He says, if this advice had been followed, it would have left almost all the economically active members of the population free to earn their livings and sustain the economy. He says no serious consideration appears to have been given to the potentially catastrophic side effects. And as he says, we're heading for an economic catastrophe, and the only plausible explanation is these things have never been properly thought through. His words, and I quote, no one in government was grown up enough to confront the real issue. Does a low risk justify a huge economic cost? And then talking about lockdowns and massive restrictions, he said, like so many of the government's measures, it's been maintained simply in order to avoid admitting that it was a mistake. He says that politicians, quote, are destroying our economy, our cultural life and our children's education in a fit of absent-mindedness. Well, the good news is that medical experts are now telling us that efforts to develop a vaccine are, quote, in a pretty good place. And they've also highlighted the fact that if you're not in the vulnerable cohort, you're not going to die if you test positive. The other good news is the Prime Minister saying, quote, you don't just shut the whole country down, that is not sustainable, which I suppose brings us back to William Gladstone, 12 years as Prime Minister of the UK, 60 years in politics. He said, men are able to mistake the feelings for the strength of their argument. The heated mind resents the chill touch and relentless scrutiny of logic. I think the public are now being heard. Some logic is emerging.